Welcome, and thank you for joining me here on the Sleepy Geographer. Tonight we'll be slowing down and drifting gently into the story of earthquakes, those sudden moments when the ground beneath us reminds us that it is alive and restless. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from. One of the quiet joys of making these videos is seeing comments from people scattered all across the world, each settling in under their own night sky. If you're new here, a like and a subscribe is always appreciated, and to those who are already part of this little sleepy community, thank you for being here once again. I do hope this video doesn't keep you awake by being too fascinating, but if it does, at least you'll have some curious new knowledge to carry into your dreams. After all, what better bedtime companion than the deep and steady rhythms of the Earth itself? So let us begin. What really happens when the planet shudders, and why does it sometimes remind us of its strength in a single startling moment? Beneath your feet, even now, the Earth is in motion. Not the kind you can sense while lying still, but a slow, almost imperceptible drift, like continents gliding upon a sea of stone. It is within this quiet movement that earthquakes are born. Earthquakes are, at their simplest, the release of built-up tension inside the Earth's crust. For years, decades, even centuries, immense pressures gather as tectonic plates push, pull, or slide past one another. Then, in an instant, the strain is released and the Earth trembles. It is the planet's way of letting go, a reminder that beneath the calm of the surface lies a restless, shifting interior. Though we often think of earthquakes only as disasters, the collapsed buildings, the trembling ground, the unsettling sense of fragility, they are also part of the grand design of the Earth itself. Without them, mountains would not rise, valleys would not form, and the landscape would remain static, lifeless, and unshaped. Earthquakes are both destroyers and creators, sculpting the very world we inhabit. To truly understand them, we must travel through multiple layers of story, from the invisible physics of seismic waves to the scars of fault lines etched into continents, from myths that once explained their mystery to the science that now measures their every pulse. We'll wander across time, through ancient tales of gods who shook the land in anger, to the modern seismographs that trace the Earth's faintest whisper. Along the way, we'll discover how humans have adapted to this restlessness. Some have built entire cultures around resilience and preparedness. Others have left behind stories carved into memory and myth. And even now, as we develop tools to measure and predict, earthquakes remain, in many ways, one of nature's greatest surprises. So tonight, let us descend into the hidden world beneath our feet, a world of pressure, motion, and sudden release, a world that shakes our cities, shapes our mountains, and silently writes the history of the Earth. And as we begin this journey, ask yourself, what does it mean to live on a planet that never truly stands still? Beneath the ground you know so well, the soil you walk on, the pavements you cross, the bedrock holding up the hills and valleys, lies a hidden engine that never truly rests. The Earth is not a solid, motionless sphere. Instead, it is layered, dynamic, and alive with forces that work on timescales so vast they make even the longest human histories seem like passing shadows. To begin understanding earthquakes, you have to travel down, deep into the restless Earth. At the very heart of the planet is the core, a blazing mass of iron and nickel. The inner part of it is solid, squeezed tight by unimaginable pressures, while the outer layer is molten and constantly in motion. This restless liquid churns and swirls, and in doing so generates the magnetic field that shields the Earth from the solar wind. Above the core lies the mantle, a vast expanse of hot, dense rock. It might be tempting to think of rock as stiff and immovable, but under the extreme heat and pressure of the mantle, rock behaves more like an extremely thick fluid. Over millions of years it flows, not like water rushing in a river, but more like the gradual creeping movement of pitch in a famous laboratory experiment. This flow of rock in the mantle is driven by convection. Imagine soup heating in a pot. The hotter liquid rises toward the surface, while cooler liquid sinks. The mantle, though unimaginably vast and heavy, behaves in a similar way. Heat from the core rises slowly upward. Rock material carries that heat, and in great circulating cells the mantle is constantly shifting. The crust above, the part we call home, is carried along like a cracked eggshell floating on this moving stew of stone. But the crust is not a single, unbroken shell. It is fragmented into immense slabs called tectonic plates. These plates can span entire continents or stretch across the width of an ocean basin. They move at speeds so slow they are almost comical, sometimes only a few centimetres a year. To put that into perspective, your fingernails grow faster than the continents drift, and yet, over millions of years, these tiny increments add up to astonishing journeys. Land masses that were once connected drift apart. Oceans open and close. Mountains rise as continents collide, and rift valleys form where land is pulled apart. These movements, although usually steady and quiet, are never perfectly smooth. At the edges of the plates, where one grinds against another, energy builds up. Rocks press and strain against each other, refusing to give way. Think of bending a stick. For a while it resists, holding its shape, but the pressure builds until, snap, the stick breaks. An earthquake is the Earth's version of that snap, a sudden release of energy that has been building invisibly over decades or centuries. The places where these breaks occur are called faults. A fault is essentially a fracture in the crust, a seam where blocks of rock meet and where motion can occur. Some faults are short and localized, others stretch for hundreds or even thousands of kilometers. Each fault is like a scar in the landscape, a record of the times the Earth has shifted and reshaped itself. Sometimes faults creep slowly, slipping bit by bit, causing little disruption. Other times they lock tight, resisting motion for centuries, until finally the accumulated stress is too great and they lurch forward all at once. That sudden movement sends seismic waves racing through the Earth, shaking everything in their path. It is this hidden tug-of-war between slow, creeping motion and sudden, violent release that makes the Earth restless. Picture two vast slabs of crust grinding against each other. They may hold firm for decades, silently straining, while cities above them go about their business. People live entire lifetimes and generations rise and fall. Then, in an instant lasting only a few seconds, the balance breaks. Buildings tremble, rivers shift course, and mountains may even be nudged a little higher. What seemed unchanging and eternal proves to be anything but. The scale of this restlessness is both humbling and strangely comforting. Plates move whether we notice them or not. Faults stretch their ancient lines across the continents, waiting patiently for their next adjustment. The mantle keeps on churning, slow but unstoppable. The entire planet is engaged in a kind of quiet dance, where tension builds, pauses, and then releases. And yet, for all their drama, earthquakes are not random acts of chaos. They are the natural consequence of a planet that is alive with energy. The Earth is constantly seeking balance. The stresses that accumulate along faults are the result of forces that never stop acting. The slow but relentless drift of continents carried by the currents deep below. Every earthquake, whether large or small, is simply the Earth's way of finding relief from those stresses, of settling back into a temporary equilibrium before the cycle begins again. From our human perspective, earthquakes seem abrupt and alarming. They arrive unannounced, sometimes with devastating consequences, but from the Earth's perspective, they are just one step in a patient rhythm that has been ongoing for billions of years. Long before cities were built, long before humans walked the land, plates collided and faults slipped, sending tremors through an ancient world. Long after we're gone, the same process will continue. What makes this restlessness so fascinating is how it links the surface we know to the hidden depths we cannot see. The next time you stand on solid ground, pause for a moment. Beneath your feet lies a crust only a few tens of kilometers thick. Beneath that, An ocean of hot, flowing rock stretches for nearly 3,000 kilometers down to the core. That restless mantle pushes at the crust, driving entire continents on journeys that last hundreds of millions of years. Every step you take is carried along by this invisible engine, and every earthquake is a reminder that the planet beneath us is far from still. In this way, earthquakes are not only geological events but also lessons in perspective. They reveal that even the ground we trust most is part of a grand, dynamic system. The Earth breathes in stone, sighs in molten rock, and occasionally shifts in ways that ripple through cities and across mountains. The restlessness of the planet is not something to fear alone, but something to recognize as part of the extraordinary story of a world that never ceases to move. If you could peel back the oceans, lift away the continents, and see the Earth from above without all the clutter of water and forests and cities, you would discover that the planet looks like a giant jigsaw puzzle, except this puzzle isn't neatly fixed together. The pieces shift and grind against each other, pulled along by the restless mantle beneath. These pieces are what scientists call tectonic plates, and they are among the most important features shaping the surface of our world. There are about a dozen major plates and many smaller ones. Some are enormous, carrying whole continents on their backs, while others are slender and largely hidden beneath the sea. Imagine the Pacific Plate, the largest of them all, sprawling under the vast Pacific Ocean, or the African Plate, which holds an entire continent and a portion of surrounding ocean floor. These plates float on the upper mantle, also called the asthenosphere, which behaves like a very thick, very slow-moving fluid. It is this hidden underlayer that allows the plates to glide, collide, and shear past each other. Though they drift only a few centimeters each year, their movements shape mountains, carve out valleys, and redraw coastlines. It's a planet in pieces, and each piece is always on the move. The best part is that the Earth doesn't do IKEA, but it's definitely a flat pack in motion. The instructions are written in rock, the screws are molten magma, and the finished product is never quite complete. The boundaries where plates meet are where the real drama unfolds. Think of them as the seams of the puzzle, places of tension, creation, and destruction. Scientists generally group these boundaries into three main types: convergent, divergent, and transform. Each one tells its own story of how the Earth sculpts itself. At convergent boundaries, plates are pushed together. What happens next depends on the type of crust involved. When an oceanic plate meets a continental one, the denser oceanic crust is forced downward into the mantle in a process known as subduction. The ocean floor literally plunges beneath the continent, creating deep trenches in the sea and powering volcanic chains on land. The Andes Mountains of South America, with their line of fiery volcanoes, are a classic example of this process. It's geology's version of a traffic jam, except instead of honking horns, you get molten rock rising to the surface. When two continental plates converge, neither wants to sink. Instead, they crumple and fold upward, creating enormous mountain ranges. The Himalayas, where the Indian plate collides with the Eurasian plate, are still rising today, pushing Mount Everest a little higher every year. Imagine two cars colliding head-on in slow motion over millions of years. The metal buckles, the structure twists, and the result is a massive pile-up of stone that towers into the sky. Then there are divergent boundaries where plates move apart. These are places of creation, where new crust forms as molten material rises to fill the gap. Beneath the oceans, divergent boundaries give rise to mid-ocean ridges, those sprawling mountain chains that snake across the seafloor for tens of thousands of kilometers. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge, for example, is a vast underwater frontier where the Eurasian and North American plates drift away from each other. Iceland, sitting right on top of this ridge, is a place where the process emerges above sea level, with steaming hot springs, volcanoes, and landscapes that feel like they belong to another world. On land, divergent boundaries can produce rift valleys. The East African Rift is one of the most striking examples, where the African plate is slowly splitting apart. lakes form in the widening gaps, volcanoes rise from the thinning crust, and in some distant future a new ocean may flood in to fill the space. It's a slow-motion unzipping of a continent, and it reminds us that the Earth's surface is never finished. The third type, transform boundaries, are where plates slide past one another horizontally. Instead of colliding or pulling apart, they grind along their edges. The San Andreas Fault in California is perhaps the most famous example. Here, the Pacific Plate is moving northwest while the North American Plate drifts to the southeast. This sideways motion doesn't build mountains or oceans, but it does create significant earthquakes. The rocks along the fault lock together, strain builds, and then they lurch forward, sending shock waves through the landscape. It's as if the planet is pulling off a slow, gritty handshake with itself. Each type of boundary, whether it is pushing, pulling, or sliding, contributes to the Earth's ever-changing geography. Mountains rise, trenches deepen, rift valleys widen, and volcanoes flare, all because of these shifting seams. What might seem like chaos at first glance is really part of a grand interconnected system that has been at work for billions of years. One of the most striking things about plate tectonics is the sheer patience of it all. The plates move only as fast as your fingernails grow, and yet over the span of geologic time they can carry continents halfway across the globe. The Atlantic Ocean, for instance, has been widening for more than 100 million years, driven apart by the mid-Atlantic ridge. At the same time, the Pacific Ocean is gradually shrinking as its plates are consumed by subduction zones. In the long run, oceans come and go, mountains rise and crumble, and continents drift like slow dancers across the stage of deep time. From a human perspective, this slow motion is difficult to grasp. Civilizations rise and fall in the blink of a geologic eye. A city built on a rift or fault line may seem timeless, yet to the planet it is little more than a temporary guest perched on restless ground. The puzzle pieces of the Earth do not care for human schedules. They shift when and how they please. What makes all this especially fascinating is that the theory of plate tectonics is relatively new. It was only in the 20th century that scientists pieced together evidence from seafloor mapping, fossil records, and magnetic patterns in rocks to confirm what Alfred Wegener had proposed decades earlier with his idea of continental drift. What once seemed like wild speculation is now a cornerstone of geology, explaining not only earthquakes and volcanoes but also the very arrangement of continents and oceans. To imagine the Earth as a planet in pieces is to recognise that nothing about it is fixed. Every mountain, every coastline, every ocean basin is part of a shifting puzzle, endlessly reworked by the forces of heat and gravity. Earthquakes are just one way the puzzle pieces jostle against one another, sudden reminders of the hidden machinery below. The rest of the time, the plates glide in silence, carrying entire worlds with them, as though the planet itself were assembling and reassembling its own furniture, flat pack style, but without ever reaching a final design. In the end, the story of tectonic plates is not one of brokenness but of motion. The Earth is not a complete puzzle waiting to be solved. It is a puzzle in progress, always changing, always reshaping itself, and always reminding us that beneath our feet lies a world in perpetual motion. When the Earth shifts suddenly along a fault, the release of energy does not simply vanish. It radiates outward, moving through rock in powerful ripples that scientists call seismic waves. These waves are the true messengers of an earthquake, carrying its story across landscapes, through mountains, and even to the far side of the planet. To understand them is to understand the very language the Earth speaks when it trembles. Seismic waves come in several distinct types, each with its own character, much like instruments in an orchestra. Some are quick and sharp, racing ahead like a sprinter. Others are slower, heavier, and more destructive, shaking the ground with rolling motions. Together they create the complex symphony of an earthquake. The first and fastest are called primary waves, or P waves. These are compressional waves, meaning they move by squeezing and stretching the rock in the direction of travel. Imagine a slinky toy being pushed and pulled along its length, and you'll have the right idea. Because they push particles back and forth, they can travel through both solid rock and liquid layers. This makes them the most versatile of seismic waves, slipping through the outer core as easily as through continental crust. When an earthquake begins, P waves are always the first to arrive at distant points. They travel at speeds of around 6 to 8 kilometers per second, which means they can race from one side of a large city to the other in just a handful of seconds. People sometimes feel them as a sharp jolt or a sudden thud, almost like a heavy truck rumbling past the building. Though rarely the most damaging, P waves are important, because they often serve as the earliest hint that something larger may be on its way. Following behind are secondary waves, or S waves. These move more slowly, typically around 3 to 4 kilometers per second, and unlike their compressional cousins, they move the ground side to side or up and down perpendicular to the direction of travel. Think of flicking a rope tied to a wall and watching the wave ripple along its length. That is how S waves behave inside the Earth. S waves can only travel through solids. They cannot pass through liquids, which is why they vanish when they encounter the molten outer core. This detail has been a gift to geologists. By noticing where S waves fail to appear on the far side of the globe, scientists were able to confirm that part of the Earth's interior must be liquid. In this way, the planet's tremors became a window into its hidden layers. For those who experience earthquakes, S waves are often the ones that truly get attention. They arrive after the quicker P waves, sometimes just a few seconds later, and they bring a stronger shaking motion. Windows rattle, furniture sways, and buildings creak as the side-to-side or up-and-down jolts ripple through. If P waves are the polite knock on the door, S waves are the sudden shove that rattles the frame. Last to arrive are the surface waves. These travel along the outer skin of the Earth, much like ripples spreading across the surface of a pond. They are slower than both P and S waves, often taking tens of seconds to cover a region, but what they lack in speed they make up for in destructive power. There are two main varieties of surface waves, love waves and Rayleigh waves, each with its own style of motion. Love waves, named after the mathematician Augustus Love, move the ground in a horizontal snake-like motion, shearing it side to side. They tend to cause buildings to sway dangerously, as structures are not usually designed to withstand such lateral force. Rayleigh waves, by contrast, roll the ground in an elliptical motion, not unlike the way ocean waves move water particles. They make the Earth itself feel as though it is undulating beneath your feet, lifting and dropping in a slow, unsettling rhythm. Surface waves are usually the most destructive phase of an earthquake because they keep the ground moving for longer periods and over wider areas. Streets can ripple, walls can twist, and bridges can sway alarmingly. People often describe the sensation as though the ground had briefly turned into liquid. In reality, it is solid ground behaving in a fluid-like way under the power of these waves. The sequence of arrival is what makes earthquakes so distinctive. First the P waves, the quick messengers, tapping lightly on the door. Then the S waves, heavier and more forceful, shaking the frame. Finally, the slow but relentless surface waves arrive, rolling through with the kind of motion that causes the most visible damage. It is a grim procession, but also a predictable one, and that predictability has been key to developing early warning systems. Because P waves move faster than the others, instruments can sometimes detect them seconds before the more damaging waves arrive. In places like Japan, Mexico and California, networks of seismometers are linked to alarms that can automatically send alerts to phones, trains and power stations. The warning may last only 10 or 20 seconds, but that is enough for people to duck under a table, for surgeons to pause a delicate procedure, or for trains to brake before entering a tunnel. A few seconds may seem small, but in an earthquake, those moments can be precious. Seismic waves also do more than shake the ground. They are tools for scientists, a kind of natural sonar that allows us to map the planet's interior. Just as doctors use ultrasound to peer inside the human body, geologists use seismic waves to probe the Earth. By studying how waves bend, slow down, or vanish as they pass through different layers, scientists have been able to sketch the structure of the core, mantle, and crust without ever needing to dig more than a few kilometers. This is how we know the inner core is solid iron, while the outer core is molten. It is how we discovered the mantle's slow convection currents. Seismic waves reveal that the Earth is not uniform but layered and dynamic, with each boundary leaving its mark on the waves that pass through. Every earthquake, even a small one, is like a free experiment conducted by the planet, offering clues about what lies beneath. The richness of seismic waves lies in their variety. Some travel straight and fast, others ripple sideways, others roll like ocean swells. Together they create the experience we call an earthquake, from the first sudden jolt to the final fading tremor. And while to us they may feel chaotic, they follow the clear rules of physics, obeying the properties of rock, liquid, and motion. For people who live in earthquake-prone regions, the knowledge of these waves is more than academic. It is part of daily life. Children in Japan, for example, practice drills where they recognize the initial jolt of a P wave and immediately prepare for the heavier shaking to follow. Engineers designing tall buildings consider how structures will respond to each type of motion. The vertical push of P waves, the shearing sway of S waves, and the rolling undulations of surface waves. To live with earthquakes is to live with their language, to know the sequence of signals the Earth sends when it shifts. Even in places far from fault lines, the echoes of seismic waves can sometimes be detected. Sensitive instruments pick up faint tremors from earthquakes on the other side of the world, ripples that have travelled through the mantle and crust for thousands of kilometres. In this way, the Earth is always speaking to itself, tremors crossing from one hemisphere to another, carrying messages from deep within. There is something almost poetic about the idea that the ground beneath us has a vocabulary. Each earthquake is a sentence, spoken in waves of compression, shear, and rolling surface motion. Some sentences are short and gentle, barely noticed. Others are long and violent, written in collapsed bridges and fractured ground. But all of them are part of the same conversation, the Earth's ongoing dialogue with itself. The language of seismic waves reminds us that the world is not silent. Beneath the calm appearance of soil and stone lies a system in constant motion, ready at any moment to send vibrations racing outward. To tune into these waves is to hear the heartbeat of a living planet, steady and unrelenting, speaking in ripples of energy that connect every corner of the globe. Across the surface of the Earth, hidden beneath forests, deserts, oceans, and even bustling cities, lie immense cracks that tell the story of the restless planet. These are faults, the great seams of the Earth's crust where blocks of rock meet, grind, and shift. To the untrained eye, many faults may appear as little more than ridges in the landscape, or faint scar-like lines stretching across valleys. But in reality, they are some of the most powerful geological features on the planet, holding the memory of countless ancient earthquakes and storing the tension of future ones. Faults come in many shapes and sizes. Some are small, a few meters long, breaking a hillside or cutting across a road. Others stretch for hundreds or even thousands of kilometers, slicing across entire countries and visible from space as jagged lines etched into the landscape. Each one is a reminder that the crust of the Earth is not a stable, unbroken surface, but rather a patchwork of moving pieces, each straining against its neighbours. Perhaps the most famous fault of all is the San Andreas in California. Running for over 1,000 kilometers from the deserts of the south to the forests of the north, it marks the boundary between the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate. It is a strike-slip fault, meaning the blocks of rock on either side move horizontally past each other, like two giant conveyor belts grinding along their edges. For those living in cities like Los Angeles or San Francisco, the San Andreas is more than just a line on a map. It is an ever-present reminder that the ground beneath their feet is a participant in a slow-motion geological drama. When stress builds along this fault and finally releases, it can trigger powerful earthquakes, as it did in 1906 when much of San Francisco was devastated. Far across the world lies the North Anatolian Fault in Turkey, another colossal strike-slip system. It stretches for over 1,000 kilometres across northern Turkey, marking the boundary between the Anatolian Plate and the Eurasian Plate. Like the San Andreas, it slips sideways, storing immense energy until sudden jolts ripple through the land. In 1999, the Izmit earthquake struck along this fault, killing tens of thousands of people and causing widespread destruction. Geologists noticed something remarkable about the North Anatolian Fault. Its major earthquakes seem to migrate westward over time, as if one rupture triggers another further along step by step. It is a haunting demonstration of how faults can behave almost like dominoes, with one shift setting off a chain reaction down the line. Another prominent fault system runs through the very heart of Europe, the Alpine Fault of New Zealand, not to be confused with the European Alps. This is the Great Scar that defines the South Island, running for about 600 kilometres. Unlike the San Andreas and North Anatolian faults, the Alpine Fault is not purely strike-slip but also has a vertical component. Here, the Pacific Plate and the Indo-Australian Plate collide in a slow-motion wrestle, sliding sideways while simultaneously crumpling upward. This combination of horizontal and vertical movement makes the fault responsible for the spectacular mountains of New Zealand. The Southern Alps rise directly along its path, growing higher with each jolt. In this way, the fault is both a destroyer and a creator, carving valleys, raising mountains, and shaping one of the most dramatic landscapes on Earth. Faults are categorized by the type of motion they produce. Strike-slip faults, like the San Andreas and North Anatolian, are sideways shifters. The rocks move horizontally, either left lateral or right lateral, depending on which way the other side appears to move from your perspective. They don't generally create towering mountain ranges, but they can split roads, displace rivers, and leave offset fences that look as though someone had mischievously slid one side of the world over by a few meters. Then there are thrust faults, which occur when rocks are pushed up and over each other. These are common at convergent plate boundaries, where one slab of crust is being forced beneath another. The Himalayas, for example, are riddled with thrust faults. As the Indian Plate collides with the Eurasian Plate, rock layers are stacked, folded, and shoved skyward, creating the highest peaks on the planet. In thrust faulting, the movement is vertical, and the results are monumental, whole ranges of mountains built stone upon stone over millions of years by countless small and large shifts. Normal faults, another important type, occur where the crust is being pulled apart. In these, one block drops downward relative to the other, forming valleys and escarpments. The Great Rift Valley of East Africa is shaped by such faults, where the continent is gradually splitting in two. Each downward slip records a moment when the land stretched and broke, leaving behind dramatic cliffs and long linear valleys that can stretch for hundreds of kilometres. What makes faults so extraordinary is that they are not just physical features. They are records of the Earth's hidden memory. Every slip, every quake, leaves behind traces. Layers of rock that once matched perfectly may be offset by meters or even kilometers, showing exactly how far the crust has moved. Streams are bent out of their courses, ancient riverbeds cut and displaced, ridges misaligned. In the walls of exposed faults, geologists can read the history of past earthquakes, like pages in a book written not in ink but in fractured stone. By digging trenches across active faults, scientists can uncover evidence of ancient ruptures. Charcoal from long-burned vegetation, sand layers, or broken soils can be dated, giving a timeline of when the Earth last shifted in that spot. This work, called paleoseismology, is like archaeology for earthquakes. It allows us to glimpse the rhythm of seismic activity, whether a fault tends to slip every few centuries, or whether it stores energy for millennia before breaking loose. Faults are also landscapes of paradox. They can be invisible until they move, or they can stand out dramatically as cliffs and scarps cutting across the land. They can be quiet for centuries, lulling nearby communities into a sense of safety, only to roar back to life in a matter of seconds. They remind us that the ground we think of as permanent is anything but. From space, satellites have revealed countless hidden faults, invisible at ground level. They map minor changes in the Earth's surface, showing how land shifts subtly, before or after an earthquake. Technology has turned the planet into its own canvas, with faults emerging as long linear strokes, sometimes stretching across entire landscapes. These scars tell us that the Earth is constantly healing and breaking, endlessly reshaping itself. Despite their destructive potential, faults are also responsible for much of the planet's beauty. Without them, mountains would not rise, valleys would not form, and many of the dramatic landscapes we admire would never exist. The Alps, the Rockies, the Andes, all owe their grandeur to the relentless work of faulting. To live near a fault is to live with uncertainty, but also with the knowledge that one is residing on the very frontier of Earth's creativity. Faults are not just fractures. They are the deep handwriting of the planet, the marks left behind by the constant rearranging of its surface. In every fault lies a story of pressure, release and renewal, etched into the crust and preserved for those who know how to read it. The scars of the planet are not blemishes. They are signatures of a world in motion, reminders that the Earth is alive, restless, and endlessly sculpting its surface. Every time the ground shifts, it is adding a new line to the grand narrative of the planet, one that stretches back billions of years and will continue for billions more. When the ground trembles, one of the first questions people ask is, how strong was it? Humans love to measure things, whether it is the height of a mountain, the depth of an ocean, or the speed of a cheetah. Earthquakes are no exception. But the Earth does not hand out neat labels for each jolt, so over the past century scientists have devised ways of quantifying the power of these restless moments. The result is a language of numbers and scales, each trying to capture the size of something both fleeting and immense. For decades, the most famous of these has been the Richter scale. Developed in the 1930s by Charles Richter and Benno Gutenberg at the California Institute of Technology, this scale became a household name. Ask anyone about earthquakes, and they are likely to mention a 7 on the Richter scale, as though that number tells the whole story. What Richter and his colleague actually did was design a way of comparing the amplitude of seismic waves recorded on instruments called seismographs. Their scale was logarithmic, meaning that each step up represented a 10-fold increase in wave amplitude. A magnitude 6 quake shakes the ground 10 times more than a magnitude 5. More importantly, in terms of energy release, each step corresponds to roughly 30 times more energy. So while a magnitude 6 is bad enough, a magnitude 7 is not just one notch worse, but tens of times more powerful. The Richter scale worked well for small to medium-sized earthquakes in Southern California, which is exactly what it was designed for. But as geologists applied it to larger and more distant quakes, they realized its limits. Very large earthquakes saturate the Richter scale, making them hard to distinguish at the top end. A truly massive quake might look not much bigger than one slightly less massive, even though the energy released could be vastly different. To address this, seismologists developed a more comprehensive measure, the moment magnitude scale. Moment magnitude takes into account not only the size of the seismic waves, but also the physical characteristics of the fault that ruptured, the area that slipped, the average amount of slip, and the rigidity of the rocks involved. This makes it a much more accurate and consistent measure, especially for the largest events. Today, when you hear that an earthquake was a magnitude 8.9, you're almost certainly hearing a value calculated on the moment magnitude scale, not Richter's original system. The numbers are similar enough that the public rarely notices the difference, but the science behind them is far more precise. Regardless of which scale is used, the numbers themselves can be deceiving. People often think of earthquakes as single events with neat, clean magnitudes, but in reality they are messy. A large quake is usually followed by countless aftershocks, some of them surprisingly powerful in their own right. Together, these sequences tell a more complex story than any single number can convey. To make sense of all this, scientists rely on instruments that are deceptively simple in principle, yet astonishing in their sensitivity. The classic image of a seismograph is of a pen attached to a lever, poised over a rotating drum of paper. As the ground moves, the drum shifts beneath the pen, tracing out jagged lines that mark each tremor. In truth, modern seismographs use electronics rather than pens and drums, but the essence remains the same, translating the Earth's vibrations into a record humans can read. What is remarkable about these devices is their ability to detect motion that no person could ever notice. A good seismometer can pick up displacement smaller than the width of a human hair, recording tremors from the other side of the world. If a strong earthquake rattles South America, instruments in Europe will register its arrival hours later, tracing the passage of waves through the planet's interior. In this way, the Earth becomes a giant laboratory, and every tremor adds to our knowledge of its inner workings. Some of the earlier seismographs built in the 19th century were works of art as well as science. Massive pendulums suspended on delicate mechanisms, carefully balanced to amplify the tiniest motions. These instruments were so finely tuned that they would sometimes pick up the footsteps of people walking nearby, or the vibrations of a passing carriage. They seemed almost alive, pens twitching at the slightest provocation, dancing to rhythms hidden beneath the ground. The global network of seismographs today is vast. Thousands of stations record earthquakes continuously, sending their data to international centres where events are catalogued and analysed within minutes. Thanks to this network, even the smallest quakes are logged, producing a living map of the planet's seismic activity. It is as though the Earth is being constantly listened to, its faint whispers captured alongside its occasional roars. All this measuring raises an important question. Why do the small earthquakes matter? Surely it is only the big ones, the ones that topple buildings and send shockwaves through society, that deserve our attention. But the truth is that small quakes are vital to understanding the whole picture. For one thing, they are far more common. While a truly great earthquake of magnitude 9 may occur only once in a century, magnitude 2 or 3 quakes happen millions of times every year. Most go unfelt, but together they release a significant amount of energy. These smaller events also reveal where stress is accumulating. By mapping the locations of countless tiny earthquakes, geologists can identify active faults, track changes over time, and sometimes even detect patterns that precede larger events. In this way, small quakes act as scouts, hinting at what might lie ahead. They are like the creaks and groans of a house settling, signals that pressure is building and adjustments are being made. From a safety perspective, small quakes can also be surprisingly helpful. They remind communities that they live in earthquake country, even if no major event has occurred for decades. A gentle shake may send people reaching for their emergency kits, updating their plans, or securing a bookshelf that could otherwise topple. In a strange way, small tremors keep us alert, ensuring that complacency does not set in. There is also the fascinating possibility that small earthquakes relieve stress on faults, reducing the chances of a catastrophic rupture. The idea is controversial, and not all scientists agree, but it is plausible that a series of modest slips may prevent a fault from locking too tightly. Whether or not this is true, the importance of studying these minor shakes cannot be overstated. They are part of the rhythm of the Earth, and ignoring them would be like listening to only the loudest notes in a symphony. When considering the scales of earthquakes, it is worth remembering just how vast the differences can be. A magnitude 5 quake may rattle windows and knock dishes from shelves, while a magnitude 9 can release energy equivalent to thousands of nuclear bombs. Yet both are measured by the same system, expressed in tidy decimals that can disguise the enormity of what they represent. Behind every number is a complex interplay of forces, waves, and faults that shape the face of the Earth. Measuring earthquakes is not about reducing them to sterile statistics. It is about giving form to the invisible, translating the shudders of the planet into a language humans can understand. From Richter's early work with seismographs in Southern California to the global networks that now span the globe, the effort has always been the same: to listen more carefully to the planet and to learn from its movements. The next time you hear about an earthquake's magnitude, pause for a moment. That number is more than just a figure on a news broadcast. It represents energy stored for decades, perhaps centuries, released in an instant. It reflects waves that travelled through layers of rock, vibrating instruments set up by dedicated scientists, and records that help protect communities across the world. Whether large or small, each quake adds another line to the story of a restless Earth. A story told in shakes, scribbles and scales, all part of the grand conversation between humanity and the planet beneath our feet. Across the long arc of human history, earthquakes have struck suddenly and left indelible marks on societies. Entire cities have been shaken to rubble. Cultures have reinterpreted their gods, and scientific revolutions have quietly germinated in the ruins. To trace the story of earthquakes through history is to see not only the destructive power of the Earth, but also the resilience, imagination, and adaptability of the people who endure them. One of the most famous quakes in recorded history occurred on the 1st of November 1755 in Lisbon, Portugal. That morning, citizens filled churches for All Saints' Day Mass, unaware that beneath their feet centuries of strain were about to release. A massive earthquake, likely around magnitude 8.5 to 9, struck the city with catastrophic force. Buildings toppled, fires ignited, and in the chaos, tens of thousands of people lost their lives. To make matters worse, a tsunami followed, surging into the city's harbour and carrying destruction far inland. The Lisbon earthquake did more than level a city. It rattled Europe's worldview. At the time, many people interpreted disasters as divine punishment. Some believed Lisbon's fall was proof of God's wrath, directed at a decadent society. Yet others, influenced by the Enlightenment, asked whether natural causes rather than supernatural ones were to blame. Philosophers such as Voltaire wrestled with the event, questioning a world in which faith and suffering seemed intertwined. The disaster spurred early studies in seismology and urban planning, as officials sought not only to rebuild but to understand. In the ashes of Lisbon, science and skepticism grew alongside grief. Leap forward to the year 1923, and across the globe another city would face a similar trial. Tokyo, already a bustling hub of modern Japan, was struck by the Great Kanto earthquake. Striking at lunchtime on the 1st of September, the magnitude 7.9 quake collapsed buildings and ignited countless cooking fires. High winds fanned the flames into a firestorm that swept through wooden neighbourhoods. Nearly 140,000 people perished in the combined quake and fires. The disaster reshaped Tokyo both physically and politically. Entire districts were rebuilt with broader streets to serve as fire breaks, and Japan invested heavily in seismology and engineering. But the quake also exposed the darker currents of fear and prejudice. In the aftermath, rumours spread that Korean residents had poisoned wells, and vigilante mobs carried out brutal attacks. Here was an earthquake that not only toppled buildings but also fractured social trust. In its wake, Japan learned hard lessons about both the resilience of cities and the fragility of human solidarity. In more recent memory, the Sichuan earthquake of 2008 struck Western China with ferocious power. Measuring magnitude 7.9, it killed nearly 90,000 people and left millions homeless. The quake was devastating not only because of its strength, but because of its timing and location. Schools collapsed in alarming numbers, and thousands of children were among the dead. The tragedy sparked widespread outrage and grief across China, with parents demanding answers about poor construction standards. The Sichuan quake revealed another truth about earthquakes. They expose vulnerabilities already present in society. A natural disaster becomes a human catastrophe when corruption, negligence, or inequality magnifies its effects. Yet even in the rubble there were stories of astonishing resilience. Rescue teams worked tirelessly, sometimes digging survivors out of collapsed buildings with bare hands. Communities rallied to support one another and international aid flowed in, reminding the world of both the fragility and the strength of human networks. 2 years later, in 2010, Haiti was struck by a magnitude 7 quake that devastated its capital, Port-au-Prince. In a matter of minutes, hundreds of thousands of people were killed, and much of the city was reduced to rubble. Haiti's vulnerability lay not only in the quake's strength but in its poverty, political instability, and weak infrastructure. Buildings were poorly constructed, emergency services were limited, and recovery was painfully slow. The disaster became a global story, drawing aid from around the world, but also raising questions about how international assistance was managed and whether it truly reached those in need. Haiti's earthquake underscored how geography and society intertwine. 2 quakes of similar magnitude can have vastly different outcomes depending on where they strike. A magnitude 7 in Japan may cause damage, but with relatively few deaths, thanks to strict building codes and extensive preparedness. The same magnitude in Haiti, with fragile infrastructure and scarce resources, was catastrophic. Earthquakes, in this way, reveal the inequalities of our world as much as they reveal the dynamics of geology. Throughout history, earthquakes have been seen through many lenses. In ancient cultures, they were often interpreted as the actions of gods or spirits. The Japanese told stories of Namazu, a giant catfish believed to thrash beneath the islands, shaking the ground whenever it moved. In Inca mythology, quakes were thought to be the trembling of a god stretching or shifting beneath the earth. In the Mediterranean, the god Poseidon was feared as the earth shaker, striking the ground with his trident. These myths were not foolish misunderstandings, but attempts to explain the inexplicable, to bring meaning to sudden devastation in a world where scientific knowledge was scarce. As science advanced, interpretation shifted. In Europe during the Enlightenment, the Lisbon earthquake helped inspire a turn away from purely supernatural explanations. By the 19th and 20th centuries, seismology had emerged as a modern science, with seismographs installed around the globe and fault lines carefully mapped. Yet even today, cultural beliefs continue to shape how earthquakes are understood and remembered. In many communities, rituals, stories and traditions preserve the memory of past quakes, keeping alive lessons about resilience and preparedness. The cities that rise and fall with tremors leave behind powerful legacies. Lisbon was rebuilt with some of the world's earliest earthquake-resistant designs, its downtown streets wide and orderly. Tokyo emerged from the Great Kanto earthquake determined to modernize and prepare, investing heavily in science and infrastructure. Sichuan became a rallying point for public demand for safer schools and better oversight. Haiti's tragedy continues to serve as a sobering reminder of global inequalities in safety and recovery. What ties all these events together is not just destruction, but transformation. Earthquakes have a way of forcing societies to confront their weaknesses, to innovate, and to reflect on their place in the world. They remind us that no city, no matter how grand or ancient, is immune to the forces of the earth. But they also remind us of human adaptability, our ability to learn, to rebuild, and to carry forward the memory of disaster as a guide for the future. Looking back across centuries, one can see earthquakes as both calamities and catalysts. They break down walls, but they also open doors to new ways of thinking. They reduce cities to rubble, but they also inspire better architecture, stronger science, and deeper reflections on what it means to live on a restless planet. Whether viewed as the wrath of gods or as the mechanics of moving plates, earthquakes have always been more than physical events. They are turning points in human stories, markers in the long dialogue between Earth and its inhabitants, reminders that the ground we trust so deeply is itself a living, shifting participant in history. Long before the language of tectonic plates and seismic waves, people faced earthquakes with no scientific framework to explain what was happening beneath their feet. All they knew was that the solid ground, which seemed like the most reliable thing in the world, could suddenly heave, split, and swallow whole communities. Faced with such terrifying unpredictability, humans turned to imagination and myth. Across cultures, earthquakes became the work of restless gods, powerful spirits, or mighty creatures hidden beneath the ground or sea. These stories offered comfort, caution, and meaning in a world where the earth itself could not be trusted to stay still. One of the most vivid traditions comes from Japan, a land crisscrossed with fault lines and often rattled by tremors. For centuries, the Japanese believed that earthquakes were caused by namazu, a giant catfish that lived beneath the islands. Namazu was thought to thrash its tail or wriggle its body whenever it grew restless, shaking the land above. The god Kashima was said to keep the catfish pinned down with a massive stone. But whenever Kashima's grip weakened, Namazu would wriggle free, unleashing devastation. The story became so ingrained in Japanese culture that even today, Namazu is a familiar figure in folklore and art. In the aftermath of the Great Edo earthquake of 1755, woodblock prints depicted the enormous catfish wreaking havoc on the city, sometimes in humorous scenes where carpenters, builders and roof tile makers profited from the destruction, thanking Namazu for the work it created. In the high Andes, the Inca people offered their own explanation. They believed earthquakes were the result of the god Pachacamac, a powerful deity associated with creation and upheaval. When Pachacamac grew restless, the earth trembled. In Incan thought, such quakes were not entirely destructive but part of the great cycle of renewal. They were moments when the divine reminded humanity of its smallness, while also reshaping the world for future generations. People responded with rituals and offerings, hoping to calm the anger of the gods and protect their villages from further shaking. Across the vast Pacific, island cultures created stories that linked quakes to the spirits of the ocean. In New Zealand, the Maori told of Ruamoko, the unborn god of earthquakes and volcanoes, still moving within the womb of the earth. His stirrings beneath the ground explained the tremors that shook the islands. For the Maori, earthquakes were not random but part of a spiritual system that connected the land, the sea, and the sky. In the Philippines, tales spoke of a huge serpent or dragon twisting beneath the earth, its movements bringing about tremors. In Samoa and Tonga, the trembling of the ground was linked to great fish, or gods shifting under the waves. In these island societies, the ocean and the earth were inseparable, so it made sense that the sea itself could be home to beings responsible for the shakes. In ancient Greece, earthquakes were the domain of Poseidon, known not only as the god of the sea but also as the earth shaker. With a thrust of his trident, Poseidon could send the ground rolling and buildings toppling. This image of an unpredictable, tempestuous deity captured the violence of earthquakes and gave them a place within a broader pantheon of natural forces. Similarly, in Norse mythology, earthquakes were sometimes explained as the struggles of the trickster god Loki. Chained in a cavern as punishment, Loki was said to writhe in pain whenever venom from a serpent dripped onto him. Each time he convulsed, the ground above quaked, a reminder of his eternal torment. What unites all these stories is the way they transformed fear into narrative. An earthquake was not just a terrifying mystery. It was the thrashing of a fish, the stirrings of a god, or the shifting of a mythical creature. These explanations brought a sense of order to chaos. If earthquakes came from Namazu or Poseidon, then perhaps they could be appeased with offerings, rituals, or prayers. Even if such acts could not stop the tremors, they gave people a feeling of agency, a way to respond to forces otherwise beyond control. This connection between earthquakes and religion was especially strong in societies where the tremors struck without warning and caused widespread devastation. After a quake, communities often sought answers in the spiritual realm. In medieval Europe, tremors were sometimes interpreted as signs of divine displeasure, punishments for sins, or omens of greater calamities. Processions, prayers, and fasts were organised to appease God and ward off further disaster. In other regions, shrines and temples were built in ways that reflected seismic fears. In Japan, for instance, traditional wooden architecture was not only practical, but also carried spiritual significance. Light wooden frames flexed with the shaking, often surviving where stone walls collapsed. Over centuries, a blend of practical engineering and spiritual tradition kept this building style alive. The rituals that developed around earthquakes were as varied as the myths. Some cultures performed offerings to calm the gods beneath the ground, while others held ceremonies to honour ancestors believed to influence the Earth's stability. These practices, though rooted in myth, often had real-world benefits. They reminded communities to remain vigilant, to rebuild together, and to maintain cultural memory of disasters so that lessons would not be forgotten. Even humour found its place. In Japan, Namazu became not only a symbol of fear, but also a kind of trickster figure. After devastating quakes, satirical prints showed the catfish distributing wealth, toppling the homes of the rich while giving opportunities to humble workers. This dual role, destroyer and benefactor, captured the strange truth of earthquakes. They cause immense suffering, but they also reshape societies, open new opportunities, and remind people of resilience. Earthquake myths are more than quaint stories. They represent an attempt to bridge the gap between human experience and planetary forces. Before seismographs and scientific theories, myths preserved cultural memory of quakes in ways that could be passed down through generations. A tale of a god's anger or a creature's thrash might have seemed fantastical, but it also kept alive the knowledge that the Earth could and would shake again. Even today, these myths retain their resonance. Namazu still appears in Japanese culture, sometimes as a cartoon mascot used in earthquake safety campaigns. The figure of Poseidon remains iconic, his trident a reminder of the ancient link between sea and quake. Around the Pacific, stories of serpents, fish, and gods continue to be told, anchoring people to both their land and their ancestors. Myths endure because they are not only explanations, but also vessels of identity, heritage, and shared experience. The way fear shaped religion, ritual, and architecture tells us something important about humanity's relationship with the Earth. When the ground betrays its stillness, humans turn to meaning-making, whether in temples, stories, or structural design. Sometimes these meanings were about appeasement, sometimes about remembrance, and sometimes about hope. All carried the same unspoken truth. To live on this restless planet is to live with mystery, and mystery often demands story. In every trembling ground, cultures found ways to weave their fear into the fabric of belief. Earthquake myths are, in a sense, the poetry of survival. Creative attempts to live with a force that cannot be controlled, only endured. Whether through gods, catfish, or serpents, these stories capture the timeless human instinct to make sense of the Earth's unpredictable voice, and to remind ourselves, again and again, that even the ground beneath us is part of a greater mystery. Earthquakes and volcanoes are often thought of as separate dramas in the theatre of nature, but in truth they are part of the same script. Both are born from the restless movements of tectonic plates, both erupt suddenly after long silences, and both remind us that the Earth is a living, shifting body. To understand how they connect is to see the deep kinship between the planet's shakes and its fiery outbursts. At their core, earthquakes and volcanoes share a common origin, the slow dance of plates riding atop the mantle. Where plates converge, diverge, or grind past one another, immense forces build. Rocks deform, faults slip, and sometimes molten rock rises to the surface. It is no coincidence that most of the world's active volcanoes and many of its largest earthquakes cluster around the same places, particularly the Pacific Ring of Fire, a vast horseshoe-shaped zone circling the ocean where subduction zones, fault lines, and volcanic arcs all crowd together. When one plate plunges beneath another in subduction, a chain of events begins. As the descending slab sinks into the mantle, it heats and releases water, which lowers the melting point of the surrounding rock. Magma forms, rises slowly upward, and gathers in chambers beneath volcanoes. Meanwhile, the grinding of the plates produces earthquakes as stress is released along the subduction fault. Thus, the same boundary produces both the jolts of seismic energy and the fiery fountains of volcanic eruptions. Earthquakes do not just occur near volcanoes by coincidence, they often act as the spark that sets them off. When a fault slips or a major quake shakes a volcanic region, the sudden change in pressure can disturb magma chambers. Cracks open, conduits shift, and molten rock that was stable may suddenly find a pathway to the surface. In this sense, an earthquake can serve as a trigger, nudging a volcano into eruption. Not every quake near a volcano results in an eruption, of course, but the link is strong enough that volcanologists keep a close watch on seismic activity as a warning sign. One of the most dramatic demonstrations of this connection came in 1883, with the eruption of Krakatoa in Indonesia. Before the main explosion, the region was rocked by earthquakes that rattled nearby islands and unsettled local communities. These tremors were the opening act, destabilizing the volcanic system. When Krakatoa finally erupted, the blast was one of the most violent in recorded history. The island was shattered, tidal waves surged across the Indian Ocean, and the sound of the explosion was heard thousands of kilometers away. For months afterward, sunsets around the world glowed with eerie colors painted by volcanic dust high in the atmosphere. In this case, earthquakes and volcanoes were not just neighbors but partners in catastrophe, each amplifying the effects of the other. Another well-known case unfolded in the United States in 1980, when Mount St. Helens erupted. Helens in Washington state erupted. In the weeks leading up to the eruption, a swarm of earthquakes shook the mountain, warning that something was stirring deep below. These quakes were small but frequent, caused by magma pushing its way upward and fracturing the rock as it went. Geologists monitored the activity closely, watching as the north side of the volcano began to bulge outward, swollen by rising magma. On May 18th, a magnitude 5.1 earthquake struck near the mountain. That jolt destabilized the already weakened flank, causing a massive landslide. The sudden release of pressure uncorked the magma chamber, and the volcano exploded sideways in a blast of ash, gas, and rock. It was one of the most studied eruptions in history, and it showed with brutal clarity how earthquakes and volcanic forces can combine to devastating effect. These dramatic events highlight the way earthquakes often precede eruptions, but they also reveal how volcanism creates its own seismic signature. Even when no major earthquake strikes, rising magma produces tremors as it cracks rock and moves through narrow conduits. These are called volcanic earthquakes or harmonic tremors, and they are among the most important clues that an eruption may be imminent. Unlike typical tectonic quakes, which occur suddenly and then fade, harmonic tremors can rumble steadily for hours or days. Scientists listen for them with sensitive instruments, treating the Earth almost like a musical instrument whose changing tones reveal what is happening below the surface. The relationship between quakes and volcanoes also extends to the landscapes they create. Where subduction zones persist, chains of volcanic mountains rise, such as the Andes in South America or the Cascades in North America. These ranges are shaped by both the uplift of tectonic compression and the eruptions of volcanoes, with earthquakes punctuating the process along the way. The result is a world of jagged peaks, steaming craters, and valleys carved by both fire and tremor. Even underwater, the partnership continues. Along mid-ocean ridges, where plates diverge, small earthquakes accompany the pulling apart of the crust. Magma rises to fill the gap, forming new seafloor and building submarine volcanoes. Sometimes these undersea eruptions break the surface, creating new islands seemingly overnight. In such places, the Earth's creative and destructive powers are inseparable, with earthquakes and volcanoes working in tandem to renew the crust. For people living near active volcanoes, this connection is a matter of life and death. Seismic monitoring provides one of the best tools for predicting eruptions, giving precious hours or days of warning. In countries like Japan, Indonesia and Italy, networks of seismometers are carefully maintained around volcanoes, tuned to detect the faintest tremors. Communities learn to read these signals, to evacuate when necessary, and to live with the knowledge that their mountains are alive. Yet for all the science, the link between earthquakes and volcanoes still carries a sense of awe. When the ground shakes and the sky fills with ash, it is easy to see why ancient people imagined gods at work. Even with modern instruments, there is something humbling about watching the planet flex both its muscles at once, shaking the crust and spewing fire in a reminder of its raw power. The lesson, perhaps, is that earthquakes and volcanoes are not separate phenomena, but different expressions of the same deep processes. They are the voice and breath of a planet that never ceases to move. Earthquakes are the sudden shouts, the sharp release of tension, while volcanoes are the fiery exhalations of molten rock. Together they shape continents, build mountains, and remind us that beneath the thin skin of soil and stone lies a world still in the making. The stories of Krakatoa and Mount St. Helens are only 2 chapters in a much longer tale, one written in ash clouds, lava flows, and trembling ground. Across the Ring of Fire and beyond, this partnership continues, sometimes quietly, sometimes explosively. To live on Earth is to live with both, to know that when the ground shakes it may also herald fire, and when a volcano stirs, the Earth's deep rumble is never far behind. When the Earth shifts on land, buildings may topple, bridges sway, and streets crack open. But when that same force erupts beneath the sea, the consequences ripple far beyond the trembling seafloor. An earthquake under the ocean can set the entire body of water into motion, unleashing waves so vast that they carry destruction across entire oceans. These waves are known as tsunamis, a Japanese word meaning harbour wave, and they are among the most devastating natural events the planet produces. The mechanics begin deep beneath the waves, along subduction zones where one tectonic plate dives beneath another. Enormous stress accumulates. When a fault finally slips, sometimes the seafloor itself shifts upward or downward by several meters in a matter of seconds. Because the ocean rests directly on this moving crust, the sudden displacement lifts or drops billions of tons of water. That vertical motion is what creates a tsunami. From there, the disturbance spreads outward in every direction, a pulse of energy carried by the sea. In the open ocean, these waves are almost invisible. Their crests may be only a few tens of centimeters high, stretched across wavelengths that can reach hundreds of kilometers. Ships at sea often pass over them without noticing, but the power hidden in their mass is staggering. As they approach shorelines, the water shallows and the wave slows down. The energy has nowhere to go but up, and the once invisible swell transforms into a towering wall of water, crashing onto coasts with unstoppable force. Throughout history, tsunamis have struck coastal communities with little or no warning, often leaving myths and legends in their wake. Ancient Greek historians wrote of waves devastating Mediterranean towns. Indigenous oral traditions along the Pacific Northwest recall great floods caused by the sea rising suddenly. For centuries, these accounts preserved the memory of the sea's reply to the Earth's quakes, even when the science behind them remained unknown. Modern understanding of tsunamis was cemented by tragedies in the last century, and none more so than the Indian Ocean disaster of 2004. On December 26th, an undersea earthquake of magnitude 9.1 to 9.3 struck off the coast of Sumatra. It was one of the most powerful quakes ever recorded. In minutes, a section of the seafloor hundreds of kilometers long lurched upward, displacing unimaginable volumes of water. The tsunami radiated outward like ripples from a stone tossed into a pond, only these ripples travelled at jetliner speeds across the ocean. Within 15 minutes, waves 30 metres high smashed into the coast of Sumatra, obliterating towns and villages. Hours later, the same waves reached Thailand, Sri Lanka and India, devastating resorts and fishing communities alike. By the time the waters subsided, more than 200,000 lives had been lost across 14 countries, making it one of the deadliest natural disasters in modern history. Whole communities vanished, and coastlines were redrawn. The tragedy was magnified by the lack of a warning system in the Indian Ocean at the time. Many people had no idea what the sudden retreat of the sea meant until the wall of water arrived. The images from 2004 are seared into collective memory. People clinging to palm trees, buildings swept away in seconds, survivors wandering stunned among the debris. Yet alongside the horror was an urgent lesson. The world realised that tsunamis were not just a Pacific problem. Until then, most investment in warning systems had been focused on the Pacific Ocean, where Japan, the United States, and other countries had long histories of dealing with such waves. The Indian Ocean disaster spurred global action, leading to the creation of international networks designed to detect undersea quakes and alert coastal populations. The mechanics of a warning system are both simple and complex. Seismographs can detect large undersea earthquakes within minutes, pinpointing their location and magnitude. But not every undersea quake produces a tsunami, so ocean-based instruments called DART buoys, short for Deep Ocean Assessment and Reporting of Tsunamis, are deployed. These devices float on the surface, tethered to pressure sensors on the seafloor. When a tsunami passes, the change in water pressure is recorded and relayed via satellite. Combined with computer models, this data allows scientists to predict which coastlines are at risk and how long they have before waves arrive. In places with effective systems, people may receive warnings ranging from a few minutes to several hours. Sirens sound, text alerts buzz, and in some countries even train systems stop automatically, preventing passengers from being caught in low-lying stations. While no system is perfect, the difference between no warning and even a short warning is enormous. Those extra minutes can save thousands of lives. The 2004 disaster also underscored the importance of public education. In some places, those who recognised the sea's sudden retreat as a sign of a coming wave ran inland and survived, while others who lingered on the beach were lost. Teaching coastal populations to recognise natural warning signs, strong ground shaking, unusual withdrawal of water, or a loud roaring from the ocean, has become just as crucial as the technology. Tsunamis are not only threats to life and property, they also leave lasting imprints on landscapes and cultures. Sediment layers deposited far inland record ancient waves, allowing scientists to trace events that happened centuries before written records. In Japan, stone markers placed hundreds of years ago warn villagers not to build homes below certain heights, reminders from ancestors who had witnessed the ocean's fury. These markers stand as quiet testaments to the fact that the sea always remembers and it always replies when the earth stirs beneath it. Despite advances, tsunamis remain challenging to predict with certainty. A quake may be massive but fail to generate significant waves, while a smaller event might trigger dangerous local surges. The relationship between earthquakes and tsunamis is complex, shaped by factors like the angle of the fault, the depth of the slip, and the shape of the seafloor. That is why global cooperation is essential. The ocean has no borders, and a wave born in one country's waters can devastate another thousands of kilometres away. For coastal societies, living with this risk has become part of life. Japan, with its long history of tsunamis, conducts regular drills, builds seawalls, and maintains extensive evacuation routes. Yet even with preparation, the sea can overwhelm human defences, as seen in the 2011 Tohoku tsunami that swept across northeastern Japan. The walls meant to hold back the sea were overtopped, nuclear facilities were damaged, and the memory of 2004 was echoed in new tragedy. What unites all these stories is the reminder that tsunamis are not just enormous waves, they are the ocean's answer to the movements of the Earth. When the seafloor lifts or drops, the water above responds with equal force, carrying the quake's message across vast distances. The physics is elegant, but the reality is brutal. The sea that nourishes life and connects continents can also rise without warning, transforming from friend to foe in minutes. And yet, there is hope in knowledge. Each disaster has pushed humanity to listen more carefully, to build better systems, and to remember the lessons etched in stone markers and passed down in oral tales. Tsunamis cannot be stopped, but they can be understood, and understanding can mean survival. To stand on a shoreline and gaze at the calm ocean is to see only one face of the sea. Beneath that serenity lies the potential for great violence, unleashed when the Earth shifts below. The tsunami is, in a way, the ocean's reply, a response to the deep rumblings of the planet. It is a reminder that the dialogue between Earth and sea is constant, and that humanity, for all its ingenuity, remains an audience to the grand conversation of the natural world. When an earthquake strikes, it is not only the Earth that breaks. Streets fracture, homes crumble, families are uprooted, and entire communities are reshaped in an instant. The raw energy of the quake is only the beginning. The true cost is measured in lives lost, people displaced, and the long, difficult road of rebuilding. Every tremor, whether small or immense, reminds us that human societies, for all their ingenuity, remain fragile against the sudden force of the shifting planet. Casualties are often the most visible measure of an earthquake's impact, yet the numbers tell only part of the story. A quake that registers the same magnitude can be a minor inconvenience in one country and a national tragedy in another. Much depends on time, location, and preparation. A tremor that hits in the middle of the night when people are at home can be far deadlier than one that happens when buildings are empty. Similarly, densely packed cities with older, poorly constructed housing suffer far more than sparsely populated areas or regions with strict building codes. After the devastation comes displacement. Survivors often find themselves with nothing but the clothes they were wearing when the shaking began. Homes collapse, water systems rupture, power lines fall, and roads crack open, leaving whole neighborhoods uninhabitable. Suddenly, thousands or even millions of people may be forced to live in tents, schools, stadiums, or open fields. In some cases, these makeshift shelters last only a few days. In others, they become semi-permanent cities of their own, standing for months or even years while reconstruction crawls forward. The human cost is not just about buildings and belongings, it is about the psychological weight of uncertainty. Those who live through a major quake often describe a lingering unease, a feeling that the ground can no longer be trusted. Even the smallest aftershock sends hearts racing. Children refuse to sleep indoors, families keep emergency bags by the door, and life is measured by the memory of the day the world shifted. The trauma does not fade quickly, and in many communities it becomes part of the cultural memory, a story passed down for generations. And yet people rebuild. It is one of the most extraordinary aspects of humanity's relationship with earthquakes. The ability to return, to restore, and to continue life on land that has betrayed its stillness. Cities such as Lisbon, Tokyo, and Mexico City have been devastated more than once, and each time they have risen again. The process is not easy, often hindered by economic challenges, political struggles, or social inequalities, but it speaks to a deep resilience. The same ground that shakes is also the ground people call home, and they rarely abandon it for long. Rebuilding after a quake is more than replacing walls and roofs. It is an opportunity to rethink how we live with the earth. In many places, this has led to ingenious approaches to construction. In earthquake-prone regions of Asia, for example, traditional bamboo houses have long offered a simple but effective solution. Bamboo, light and flexible, bends with the shaking rather than resisting it. Walls may crack, but the structure sways and often survives. These designs, passed down through generations, are a reminder that sometimes tradition carries more wisdom than modern concrete. In other regions, engineers have embraced technology to create buildings that can withstand staggering amounts of movement. Japan is at the forefront of this effort, with skyscrapers that rest on giant shock absorbers or sit atop base isolation systems that allow the ground to move beneath them without transferring the full force to the structure above. Some of these towers can sway several feet in either direction during a quake, prompting the slightly comical but oddly comforting phrase, "Jelly buildings are oddly reassuring." Watching a tower of steel and glass wobble like gelatin may not inspire confidence at first, but it is precisely that ability to flex and bend that keeps it from breaking. Modern engineering has even turned earthquakes into opportunities for creativity. Bridges in seismic zones are designed with flexible joints that absorb shocks. Dams are built with wide foundations that reduce stress. Museums and archives are fitted with base isolators to protect priceless cultural treasures from shaking. Around the world, architects and engineers collaborate not only to build for beauty and utility, but to build for survival. Still, the contrast between wealthy nations and poorer regions remains stark. A modern office tower in Tokyo may sway safely during a magnitude 7 quake, while a poorly constructed apartment block in a developing city may collapse entirely under the same force. This inequality is part of the human cost too. The Earth's tremors do not discriminate, but human systems often do. Where poverty limits the quality of construction, where corruption undermines building codes, or where rapid urbanization outpaces regulation, the toll of earthquakes rises sharply. The resilience of communities, however, is not determined solely by money or engineering. Social bonds, cultural memory, and preparedness play enormous roles. In some rural villages, tightly knit communities are able to mobilize quickly, sharing food, shelter, and labor to rebuild. In urban centers, public drills and education campaigns teach children how to duck, cover, and hold on, embedding safety into daily life. These cultural practices can save lives just as surely as steel reinforcements or base isolators. In the aftermath of quakes, rebuilding often brings with it small but meaningful acts of adaptation. Families may strap furniture to walls to prevent it from toppling. Neighborhoods may organize communal water storage. Governments may invest in early warning systems that give people a few precious seconds to seek safety. The cost of an earthquake is immense, but it often sparks innovations and habits that endure long after the rubble is cleared. Humour too plays a role in survival. People who live with the constant risk of tremors often joke about the quirks of life in seismic zones. They laugh about wobbling chandeliers, about pets who seem to sense quakes before humans do, or about the strangely reassuring sight of a skyscraper shimmying like jelly. These small jokes are not frivolous. They are a way of coping with fear, of reclaiming power in the face of something uncontrollable. To find laughter amid the ruins is a sign of resilience as profound as any engineering achievement. Ultimately, the human cost of earthquakes cannot be measured only in dollars or numbers. It is about lives altered, communities transformed, and societies tested. It is about the grief of loss, but also the stubborn determination to rebuild. The shaking ground may take away homes, but it cannot erase the will to adapt, to remember, and to carry on. Every quake is both a tragedy and a teacher. It shows where weaknesses lie, whether in infrastructure, in governance, or in preparedness. It challenges us to imagine new ways of building, new ways of living, and new ways of supporting one another. The scars it leaves behind, in stone, in memory, and in story, remind us that while the Earth's power is immense, so too is the resilience of humanity. And perhaps, in the gentle wobble of a jelly-like skyscraper, or the graceful bend of a bamboo house, we find a symbol of that resilience, flexible, adaptable, and determined not to break. To live in certain parts of the world is to accept that the ground may one day rise against you. Earthquakes are not rare accidents in these regions. They are part of the backdrop of life, as ordinary as the weather and as certain as the tides. Japan, Chile, and California are three places where seismicity has shaped not only the landscape, but also the character of societies. In each, people have learned not just to endure earthquakes, but to weave them into daily routines, architecture, and even cultural identity. In Japan, earthquakes are a constant companion. Sitting at the junction of four major tectonic plates, the country experiences thousands of tremors every year, though most are too small to notice. Large ones, however, are frequent enough that preparedness is ingrained in the national psyche. Children in schools grow up with regular earthquake drills, ducking under desks when alarms sound. Public service announcements remind families to keep emergency kits stocked with water, food, and flashlights. Even the architecture reflects this ever-present awareness. Skyscrapers sway gracefully thanks to base isolators and tuned mass dampers, while ordinary homes often incorporate lightweight wooden frames designed to flex rather than fracture. Perhaps what is most remarkable in Japan is the cultural resilience that accompanies the science and engineering. After the devastating Tohoku earthquake and tsunami in 2011, communities in the affected areas displayed extraordinary solidarity. Volunteers poured in from across the country, neighbours supported each other with food and shelter, and a stoic determination carried many through the darkest months. The concept of gamen, enduring hardship with patience and dignity, became visible on a national scale. It is a reminder that survival is not just about physical structures, but about shared values and collective strength. Far across the Pacific, Chile is another country where seismicity is not a surprise but an expectation. Stretching along the edge of South America, Chile sits atop one of the most active subduction zones in the world, where the Nazca Plate dives beneath the South American plate. The result is frequent, sometimes massive earthquakes, including the largest ever recorded, the Valdivia Quake of 1960, which reached magnitude 9.5. That event generated tsunamis that raced across the Pacific, proving that Chile's seismic activity can shake not only its own borders, but the entire ocean basin. Chile's response to its seismic environment has been both practical and cultural. Building codes are among the strictest in the world, and engineers have become global leaders in earthquake-resistant design. When a magnitude 8.8 quake struck in 2010, the country suffered terrible losses, yet many modern structures withstood the shaking thanks to decades of investment in seismic safety. Like Japan, Chile integrates drills into schools and public life, ensuring that even children know instinctively what to do when the ground begins to move. But resilience in Chile is not just technical, it is also social and emotional. Earthquakes are part of the national memory, spoken of in literature, song, and everyday conversation. They are reminders of both vulnerability and endurance, woven into the fabric of Chilean identity. The people live with the knowledge that the earth may one day rise again, and instead of ignoring it, they acknowledge it, plan for it, and adapt around it. California offers a third perspective on living with earthquakes, one shaped by a blend of science, culture, and a certain amount of humour. The state sits astride the San Andreas Fault, and a web of smaller faults that crisscross its valleys and mountains. Earthquakes are frequent, and while most are small, the threat of a big one looms in the collective imagination. Californians, perhaps more than anyone, have turned earthquake preparedness into both a science and a lifestyle. Schools across the state conduct annual drills known as the Great Shakeout, where millions of students, workers and residents practice ducking under desks, covering their heads, and holding on until the imaginary shaking stops. Emergency kits are marketed in stores, and public awareness campaigns remind people to secure heavy furniture and keep water supplies ready. At the same time, Californians often meet the threat with humour. Earthquake jokes circulate as easily as weather updates, and many residents swap stories of where they were during memorable shakes, often with a mixture of awe and levity. Engineering, as in Japan and Chile, plays a central role. California's iconic bridges, from the Golden Gate to the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge, have undergone extensive retrofitting to withstand seismic shocks. Skyscrapers in Los Angeles and San Francisco are built with designs that allow them to sway like giant reeds, rather than snap under stress. The result is a landscape that has been consciously moulded not only by geology but by human ingenuity determined to coexist with it. What unites these three regions is the way earthquakes have moved from being seen as unpredictable disasters to challenges that can be anticipated and managed. No one can prevent the ground from shaking, but people can prepare for it, and that preparation is as much cultural as it is technical. In Japan, resilience is tied to values of endurance and community. In Chile, it is reinforced through national pride and world-class engineering. In California, it blends into a culture of innovation and occasionally casual humour that treats earthquakes as just another part of life. Living with earthquakes also means remembering. Memorials to past disasters serve as both tributes to those lost and reminders of what must be learned. In Japan, towns devastated by tsunamis have built markers and museums to ensure future generations do not forget. In Chile, the memory of the 1960 quake still informs policies and planning today. In California, the ruins of past quakes, like the broken facades from San Francisco's 1906 disaster, are preserved in archives and photographs, anchoring modern preparedness to historical experience. Preparedness, of course, is never complete. Every earthquake is slightly different, every rupture unique. Yet the cultures of these regions demonstrate that resilience is not about eliminating risk, but about weaving it into the rhythm of life. Drills may seem mundane, but they instill habits that save lives. Strict building codes may cost more up front, but they preserve cities when disaster strikes. Shared stories and cultural attitudes provide the emotional backbone that allows communities to recover and rebuild. The ground may be restless, but people are resourceful. Across the world's seismic hotspots, societies have proven that it is possible not only to survive earthquakes, but to adapt around them, to build cultures that are stronger because of the very forces that challenge them. To live with earthquakes is to accept uncertainty, to practice resilience, and to carry forward a collective wisdom born of centuries of shaking. It is a reminder that humanity's greatest strength is not in preventing the Earth from moving, but in learning how to move with it. To think of earthquakes only in terms of human lifetimes is to miss their grandest role. The true story of earthquakes stretches across deep time, shaping mountains, carving valleys, and rearranging continents long before the first city was ever built. Every jolt we feel today is part of a far older rhythm, a pulse that has been beating since the Earth's crust first cracked and shifted billions of years ago. Mountains, for instance, are monuments to the work of countless earthquakes. When tectonic plates collide, the crust folds, breaks, and is pushed upward, but this does not happen in a single sweeping motion. Instead, the rise of a great range like the Himalayas or the Andes is punctuated by millions of seismic jolts, each one adjusting the land a little higher, each one contributing to the towering heights we see today. Imagine the world's greatest ranges not as permanent fixtures, but as living works in progress, sculpted quake by quake, over spans of time so vast they defy imagination. Mount Everest itself, the tallest peak on Earth, inches skyward thanks to this ongoing dance of strain and release, proving that mountains are not still giants, but restless children of earthquakes. Valleys too bear the fingerprints of seismicity. Along rift zones where the crust is being stretched, earthquakes help drop blocks of land downward, leaving behind long, narrow valleys flanked by steep cliffs. The East African Rift is a striking example. Here, Africa is slowly splitting apart, and earthquakes mark the process step by step. Lakes fill the low-lying basins while scarps rise abruptly from the plains. Each tremor may move the land by only a few centimeters, but multiplied across millions of years, the result is a whole continent changing shape. What looks like a peaceful landscape of lakes and grasslands is, in reality, a record of repeated breaks in the Earth's surface. Even entire continents owe their outlines in part to seismic upheaval. The edges of South America, for instance, are defined by the constant subduction of the Nazca Plate beneath it. Every large quake along this margin has not only shaken human settlements, but has also nudged the continent into its current form. Australia's deserts, North America's ranges, and Europe's jagged coasts all tell stories of ancient ruptures. Earthquakes have opened oceans, closed seas, and shifted entire land masses. They are the chisels with which the Earth redraws its surface over geological epochs. The fossil record, often thought of as still and silent, also contains echoes of earthquakes. Sedimentary layers that seem perfectly horizontal may suddenly be offset, bent, or cracked, revealing the passage of ancient tremors. Sometimes fossils themselves are caught in the middle of this disruption. In certain deposits, skeletons of marine creatures are found jumbled together, as though shaken loose from the seafloor by seismic waves. In other cases, layers of ash, mud, or sand deposited by quake-triggered landslides bury life in an instant, preserving snapshots of ancient ecosystems. One of the most intriguing geological phenomena linked to earthquakes is called seismite. These are deformed layers of sediment that bear the unmistakable marks of shaking. Rippled surfaces, contorted bedding, and injection structures all testify to ancient seismic activity. Some seismites are hundreds of millions of years old, silent records of quakes that rocked long-vanished seas. By studying them, scientists can reconstruct the timing and scale of earthquakes in deep time, extending knowledge far beyond the short window of human history. There are also cases where earthquakes may have influenced the course of evolution itself. When land shifts abruptly, rivers change direction, coastlines alter, and habitats are destroyed or created. Populations of animals and plants may be split apart by newly formed valleys, or joined together by collapsing barriers. In this way, earthquakes have acted as hidden agents of change, nudging life along unexpected paths. The distribution of fossils across continents, the sudden appearance of new species in one area, and the disappearance in another, often owes something to the subtle or catastrophic rearrangements caused by seismic events. The story of deep-time earthquakes can be glimpsed in places where the scars remain visible, even after millions of years. Fault lines cutting through ancient rocks, their polished surfaces gleaming like glass, tell of colossal forces released in distant ages. Some faults date back to the Precambrian, more than half the age of the Earth itself. Standing at one of these scars is to stand at the edge of deep history, touching the remnants of tremors that shook a world unrecognizable to us. In North America, for example, the New Madrid seismic zone is famous for quakes in the early 19th century, but its roots go back far deeper into the buried rifts of an ancient continent. In Scandinavia, faults record tremors from the end of the last ice age, when the melting of colossal glaciers caused the crust to rebound, cracking and jolting the land. In Africa, fault systems hundreds of millions of years old still cut across the deserts, reminders of supercontinents that split apart long before humans evolved. Even the grandest cycles of continental drift, the assembly and breakup of supercontinents like Pangaea and Gondwana, were marked by earthquake after earthquake. As plates collided to form vast land masses, quakes accompanied the folding and thrusting of mountain chains. When those continents later split, rifts opened with seismic jolts, tearing apart once unified worlds. Every stage of the planet's shifting map has been punctuated by the rumble of earthquakes, each one a tiny note in the immense symphony of geological time. What is perhaps most humbling is the scale. Earthquakes that seem immense to us powerful enough to topple cities, are small flashes in the planet's long history. Over millions of years, the cumulative effect of countless quakes has raised entire ranges, opened deep oceans, and reshaped the flow of life itself. In the fossil record, in the structure of mountains, in the scars of faults preserved in ancient stone, the Earth's seismic memory is written. When you look at a mountain range, you're seeing more than just rock. You're seeing the frozen evidence of earthquakes piled one upon another. When you stand in a valley formed by rifting, you're standing in the footprint of repeated tremors. When you hold a fossil from a disturbed layer, you're holding a relic of a moment when the Earth shook long before humans gave such events a name. To think of earthquakes in deep time is to expand perspective. The ground beneath us has been shifting and quaking for billions of years, long before the first footprints appeared on its surface. Every tremor today is part of that same story, a continuation of the process that built the landscapes we inhabit and scattered the fossils we study. The Earth is restless, and it always has been. To walk upon its surface is to tread on the history of its endless shaking, written not just in human memory but in the very bones of the planet itself. When people think of earthquakes, they often imagine trembling cities, swaying towers, and cracked highways here on Earth. But our planet is not the only world that shudders and groans. Quakes, in one form or another, ripple through other rocky bodies in our solar system, each with its own distinct character. Mars quakes, moon quakes, and even tremors on distant moons tell us that restless interiors are not unique to Earth. Instead, they are a universal feature of rocky worlds, each speaking in its own subtle language of cracks and vibrations. In recent years, Mars has become the newest member of the seismic family, thanks to NASA's InSight mission. Launched in 2018, InSight landed on the plains of Elysium Planitia and gently placed a seismometer on the Martian surface. This delicate instrument, shielded by a dome against wind and temperature fluctuations, began listening for the faintest vibrations from below. For months, it seemed Mars was stubbornly silent. Then in 2019, the first definitive Mars quakes were recorded. These quakes were not enormous. Most were the equivalent of small earthquakes here on Earth, but their importance was immense. They proved that Mars is not geologically dead. The crust still shifts, fractures still move, and energy is still being released from deep within. Over time, InSight recorded hundreds of Mars quakes, some caused by faults in the crust, others by meteorite impacts striking the surface. The patterns revealed that the red planet is more active than expected, with seismic energy offering clues about its inner layers. One of the most fascinating findings was that Mars quakes tend to last longer than typical earthquakes. Because Mars lacks oceans and a thick atmosphere, there is less to absorb and scatter seismic waves. Vibrations linger, echoing through the planet like a bell struck in a quiet room. From these echoes, scientists pieced together a model of Mars's interior, confirming that it has a large liquid core, a mantle, and a surprisingly thin crust. In this way, the tremors of a distant planet became tools for planetary anatomy. If Mars offers a story of quiet but meaningful activity, the Moon tells one of cooling and contraction. Our lunar companion is smaller than Earth and has long since lost much of its internal heat. But this cooling has consequences. As the Moon's interior solidifies and contracts, the outer crust must adjust, cracking and shifting to fit the shrinking sphere. These adjustments produce what scientists call moonquakes. Apollo astronauts in the 1960s and 70s left behind seismometers on the Moon, and for years after they transmitted data back to Earth. The results were surprising. The Moon is seismically active, though in its own peculiar way. 4 main types of moonquakes were identified. Some were shallow, caused by the cooling and contracting crust. Others were deep, originating hundreds of kilometers down. A third type was triggered by tidal forces, as Earth's gravity flexed the Moon like a rubber ball. The fourth type came from meteorite impacts, a constant hazard in the airless environment. Moonquakes can be unexpectedly strong. Some shallow ones registered at magnitudes around 5 on Earth's scales, enough to cause real damage if there were buildings on the surface. Worse, lunar tremors can last for astonishingly long periods. Without water or an atmosphere to dampen the vibrations, seismic waves can echo for up to an hour. Imagine the ground gently rocking long after the initial jolt, the entire world ringing like a tuning fork struck against stone. The evidence of moonquakes is also etched into the surface. The lunar landscape is crisscrossed with small cliffs and scarps, the result of the crust buckling as the moon continues to contract. These features are relatively young in geological terms, suggesting the moon is still slowly shrinking. It may be a quiet, grey world to the human eye, but beneath that stillness lies a body still adjusting to its frozen heart. Comparing Earth to its planetary siblings highlights just how unusual our world really is. Earthquakes are tied to plate tectonics, a system that constantly recycles crust, builds mountains, and reshapes continents. Neither Mars nor the Moon has active plate tectonics today. Mars once had massive volcanoes like Olympus Mons, the largest in the solar system, but those days of vigorous activity are largely over. The Moon has long been geologically dormant, save for its slow contraction. In contrast, Earth's surface remains lively and changeable, fueled by abundant internal heat and lubricated by the presence of water. This difference has profound consequences. Earth's quakes are destructive, yes, but they are also part of what makes the planet habitable. The constant recycling of crust drives the carbon cycle, stabilizing the climate over millions of years. Without plate tectonics, Earth might resemble Mars, cold, dry and silent, or it might resemble the Moon, small, shrinking and largely frozen in time. Our quakes, unsettling as they may be, are signs of a planet that is alive in the deepest sense. Yet the similarities are also striking. The tremors on Mars and the Moon remind us that all rocky worlds must cope with stresses in their crusts. Cooling, contraction, impacts or residual activity. Each leaves behind quakes that whisper secrets about the interior. These planetary tremors are like diagnostic tests, revealing structures and histories we could never otherwise access. By listening carefully, scientists have turned distant worlds into open books. Other bodies may quake as well. Mercury, like the Moon, has contracted as it cooled, leaving great scarps across its surface that hint at past seismic jolts. Jupiter's moon, Europa, may experience ice quakes as its frozen crust shifts over a liquid ocean below. Even Titan, Saturn's enigmatic moon, might have its own version of seismicity, with tremors in ice and methane seas. Quaking, it seems, is not an earthly monopoly, but a universal expression of planetary restlessness. For humanity, the study of planetary quakes is more than scientific curiosity. It prepares us for exploration. When astronauts return to the Moon, understanding moonquakes will be vital for building habitats that can endure hours of gentle rocking. If humans one day settle on Mars, monitoring Mars quakes will be as routine as checking the weather. Living on other worlds will mean learning to live with their tremors, just as people on Earth have adapted to theirs. There is also something profoundly poetic about hearing the quakes of other worlds. The recordings from InSight on Mars, faint but distinct, carry the sound of a planet shifting in its sleep. The Apollo seismometers captured the Moon's eerie echoes, long vibrations that speak of a shrinking heart. These signals are not just data, they are voices, reminders that even silent worlds have their own rhythms. When the ground shakes on Earth, it may bring fear, but it also connects us to something larger. We are part of a family of worlds, all of them restless in their own way. Mars shudders as its crust adjusts. The Moon cracks as it cools. Earth rumbles as plates grind and slide. Each tells its story in vibrations. Each reminds us that nothing in the cosmos is truly still. To reflect on planetary quakes is to realize that trembling ground is not an anomaly, but a feature of living, changing worlds. From the plains of Mars to the highlands of the Moon, From the scarps of Mercury to the icy shells of Europa, the solar system quakes with quiet energy. Earth may be the most dramatic in its restlessness, but it is not alone. Across the heavens, planets and moons shift and settle, each one speaking in the subtle, unending language of quakes. For most of history, earthquakes were seen as forces entirely separate from the surface world of weather and climate. The ground shook because of deep processes inside the Earth, far beyond the reach of rain, wind, or ice. Yet in recent decades, scientists have begun asking an intriguing question. Could what happens at the surface, melting glaciers, rising seas, even artificial reservoirs, influence what happens far below? The answer, as it turns out, is more complex than a simple yes or no, and it reveals the delicate balance between the outer layers of the planet and its restless interior. The idea may sound counterintuitive. How could melting ice or filling a lake affect something as powerful as an earthquake? But the Earth's crust, for all its apparent solidity, is sensitive to changes in weight and pressure above it. Imagine the crust as a mattress. Push down and it compresses. Lift off the weight and it springs back. Over short time scales, the effect might be small, but over decades or centuries, the removal or addition of enormous masses can subtly shift the stresses locked in faults, sometimes enough to tip the balance toward a rupture. Glaciers are a prime example. During the last ice age, vast ice sheets covered large parts of North America, Europe, and Asia. These sheets were kilometers thick and weighed so much that they pressed the crust downward into the mantle. When the ice melted at the end of the ice age, the crust began to rebound, slowly rising back toward its former level. This process, known as isostatic rebound, continues even today. As the crust adjusts, stresses shift, and in some regions, earthquakes result. Scandinavia, for example, still experiences quakes linked to the retreat of ancient glaciers. Though most of these are small, they are direct evidence that the weight of ice and its removal can indeed influence seismic activity. Now, with modern climate change driving rapid glacier melt in Greenland, Alaska, and the Himalayas, the question takes on new urgency. Could today's melting ice sheets trigger earthquakes in the future? Some scientists suggest the answer is yes. As the Greenland ice sheet thins, the crust beneath it is rebounding. This adjustment may alter stresses not only locally, but also along distant faults, potentially making them more prone to slip. In the Himalayas, retreating glaciers may play a subtle role in changing the balance of forces in an already seismically active region. While these effects are unlikely to produce entirely new fault systems, they can influence the timing of quakes that were already inevitable. Reservoirs provide another fascinating case. When large dams are built and valleys are flooded, the added weight of water can press down on the crust and seep into faults. This is known as reservoir-induced seismicity. In most cases, the quakes are small, but there have been notable exceptions. The Koinanaga Dam in India, completed in the 1960s, was followed by a series of earthquakes, including a magnitude 6.3 event in 1967 that killed nearly 200 people. The evidence suggests that the filling of the reservoir altered stresses and allowed water to lubricate a fault, making it easier for it to slip. Other dams, from China to the United States, have shown similar, though usually less dramatic patterns. The lesson is clear. Even human activities can sometimes tip the balance in fault systems already poised near the breaking point. While no one would argue that a dam alone could create a fault, the additional pressure and lubrication can act as the final straw in a system under strain. These cases highlight a key idea. The Earth is not divided into separate realms of surface and interior, but is instead a tightly interconnected system. What happens above? Ice accumulating, water rising, forests growing or disappearing, can feed back into the deeper layers. The crust is sensitive to loading and unloading, and while it may take decades, centuries, or even millennia, the balance of stresses shifts in response. This balance is delicate. Consider the concept of earthquake clocks. Faults accumulate strain over long periods, and eventually they must release it. External factors like melting glaciers or filling reservoirs may not create earthquakes out of thin air, but they can nudge the clock forward or delay it slightly. A quake that might have happened 50 years later could occur today instead, hastened by changes in surface conditions. This leads to a sobering reflection on the future. As global warming accelerates, ice sheets are melting at unprecedented rates, and sea levels are rising. The redistribution of this mass across the planet's surface is not trivial. It represents billions of tons of water moving from land to ocean. Could this shifting load influence seismic and volcanic activity in the coming centuries? Some researchers believe so. Rising seas may weigh down ocean basins, altering stresses along coastal faults. Meanwhile, the removal of ice from polar regions could set off subtle adjustments that echo in earthquakes or even volcanic eruptions. The Earth, it seems, responds to changes in ways both immediate and long-lasting. It is tempting to imagine dramatic scenarios, but the reality is more nuanced. The effects of climate change on earthquakes will likely be modest compared to the primary drivers of tectonics, mantle convection, plate motion, and the immense energies stored in the Earth's crust. Yet the evidence shows that the surface and the deep interior are not isolated worlds. They interact, sometimes quietly, sometimes catastrophically in ways we are only beginning to understand. What is perhaps most remarkable is how this understanding reframes our relationship with the Earth. We often think of ourselves as small compared to tectonic forces, powerless to influence the great machinery of the planet. Yet here is proof that human activity, by building dams or altering the climate, can have measurable effects on the Earth's seismic behaviour. We are no longer mere passengers on a restless planet. We are participants in its story, nudging the balance in subtle but significant ways. The debate over earthquakes and climate also reminds us of the importance of humility in science. For centuries, people interpreted earthquakes as divine acts, beyond human comprehension. Modern science has replaced myth with measurement, but uncertainties remain. Predicting exactly when or where an earthquake will strike is still beyond reach, and the role of surface changes in that process is a frontier of research. Every quake, every tremor, adds a new piece to the puzzle, challenging assumptions and broadening our perspective. In the end, whether caused by deep tectonic motion or influenced by surface changes, earthquakes remind us of the Earth's interconnectedness. The crust, the mantle, the atmosphere, the oceans, and the cryosphere all are parts of one dynamic system. When ice melts, when seas rise, when water fills a valley, the planet responds, not always immediately, but inevitably. The ground beneath our feet is sensitive to the world above, just as the world above depends on the restless energy below. To consider earthquakes in the context of climate is to appreciate the Earth as a single, living whole. The tremors we feel are not isolated phenomena, but part of a vast web of interactions, where surface and depth, water and stone, ice and fire are forever intertwined. It is a reminder that our actions too ripple through this system, influencing the rhythms of a planet that is at once fragile and formidable, balanced on the edge of forces far greater than ourselves. For as long as people have lived with earthquakes, there has been a dream, to know when the next one will strike. Not just a general sense of sometime in the future, but a precise warning, the date, the time, perhaps even the magnitude. Such knowledge would change everything. Cities could evacuate before disaster, bridges could be cleared, and lives could be saved. Yet despite decades of effort, earthquakes remain among the most stubbornly unpredictable phenomena on Earth. They arrive unannounced, with little more than a rumble of warning as seismic waves rush out from the fault. The challenge is not that scientists do not understand earthquakes, but that the forces behind them are too complex, too hidden, and too variable to pin down exactly. At the heart of the difficulty is the way stress builds inside the Earth. Faults accumulate strain as tectonic plates grind and shove against one another, but the rate of that build-up is not always steady. One section of a fault may creep along quietly, releasing energy bit by bit, while another section locks tightly, hoarding its strain for decades or centuries. When the locked section finally gives way, the result can be catastrophic. The problem is that no one can say exactly when that tipping point will arrive. A fault can hold for years longer than expected or rupture sooner than models predict. The Earth in this sense is like a gambler who never reveals when it plans to fold its cards. Scientists have long searched for reliable precursors, signals that might betray an impending quake. One idea is the concept of seismic gaps. Along major fault lines, earthquakes tend to occur in specific segments. Some parts of a fault may rupture frequently, while others appear quiet for centuries. These quiet sections, the gaps, are thought to be storing up strain, making them candidates for future earthquakes. The San Andreas Fault in California, for example, has been scrutinized for decades, with researchers noting stretches that have not broken in living memory. While this approach gives a broad sense of where the risk is high, it does not provide the precision people crave. A seismic gap may rupture tomorrow or in 50 years. The uncertainty remains maddeningly wide. Another area of speculation has been animal behavior. Stories abound of dogs barking wildly, cats fleeing homes, or farm animals acting strangely before a quake. In China, in 1975, authorities evacuated the city of Haicheng partly because of unusual animal behavior combined with foreshocks. A large earthquake struck soon after, and the evacuation is often cited as a success. Yet attempts to rely on animals as living seismographs have not yielded consistent results. For every story of a dog that seemed to sense a quake, there are countless cases where no animals reacted at all. It is possible that some creatures can detect vibrations or changes in groundwater before humans notice, but as a predictive tool, animal behavior remains more folklore than reliable science. Instead of prediction, researchers have turned their attention to early warning systems, a subtle but important distinction. These systems do not forecast earthquakes in advance. Rather, they detect the first seismic waves of a quake and send alerts before the more destructive waves arrive. Because primary waves, the fastest type, travel faster than secondary or surface waves, instruments can register them and transmit warnings to nearby communities. The time window is short, often just a few seconds, but those seconds can save lives. Trains can be stopped, surgeons can pause delicate operations, and children can dive under desks. In Mexico City, the early warning system has given residents critical seconds to prepare for powerful quakes originating on the Pacific coast. In Japan, alerts arrive on phones, television broadcasts and public loudspeakers, sometimes providing up to a minute's notice for distant quakes. The elegance of these systems lies in their practicality. They do not claim to predict the unpredictable, they simply make the most of the physics of seismic waves. Still, even the best systems are limited. People close to the epicenter may have no warning at all because the damaging waves arrive too quickly. Others may get a false alarm if the system detects a quake that turns out to be minor. Yet despite imperfections, early warning is one of the most tangible successes in the long struggle against earthquake uncertainty. Beyond early warning, scientists continue to study a host of potential indicators. Variations in groundwater chemistry, changes in radon gas emissions, fluctuations in the electromagnetic field, all have been observed before some quakes. But the challenge is consistency. These signals may appear before one quake and not before another, making them unreliable as universal predictors. The Earth is a noisy system, full of fluctuations that have nothing to do with seismic activity, and distinguishing meaningful signals from background chatter is enormously difficult. Part of the unpredictability also lies in scale. Earthquakes are not single, isolated events, but complex processes involving networks of faults that may interact in unexpected ways. A rupture on one fault can transfer stress to another, setting off a chain reaction across hundreds of kilometres. The 1999 Izmit quake in Turkey, for instance, seemed to march westward along the North Anatolian Fault, each rupture triggering the next. Predicting not only the first quake but the cascading sequence that may follow is a challenge far beyond current models. In some ways, the difficulty of predicting earthquakes has reshaped how societies respond. Instead of waiting for a day when prediction becomes possible, communities have invested in resilience. Building codes, emergency planning, drills, and education are treated as the real defences against uncertainty. If the timing of quakes cannot be known, the best strategy is to be ready at all times. This philosophy may lack the glamour of precise prediction, but it has saved countless lives. Still, the search continues. Seismologists deploy dense networks of instruments along faults, hoping to capture the faintest signs of impending rupture. Supercomputers model the complex physics of rocks under stress, trying to simulate the unpredictable. Satellites measure tiny changes in the Earth's surface, detecting strain as it accumulates invisibly. Each effort adds a little more knowledge, even if the holy grail of accurate prediction remains elusive. There is something almost poetic in the idea that earthquakes resist prediction. For all our scientific progress, the Earth retains its mysteries, its refusal to be neatly categorized or forecast. The unpredictability of quakes is both a frustration and a reminder of humility. It tells us that not everything can be controlled, not every risk eliminated. Living with earthquakes means accepting uncertainty as part of existence, learning to adapt to a world that is never entirely stable. Perhaps that is why so many cultures have developed stories, rituals, and resilient practices around earthquakes. They remind us that survival does not come from perfect foresight, but from readiness, adaptability, and community. Scientists may one day discover signals that reliably precede quakes, but until then, humanity continues to live in partnership with uncertainty, preparing, rebuilding, and enduring. In the end, predicting the unpredictable may never be possible, but that does not mean progress is futile. Early warning systems, seismic monitoring, and resilient societies show that even in the absence of certainty, much can be done. The Earth will continue to tremble without announcing its schedule, but people will continue to listen, prepare, and adapt. And perhaps, in that constant effort, there lies a deeper kind of security, not the promise of prediction, but the practice of resilience in the face of a restless world. Looking ahead into the future of earthquakes is a little like staring into the horizon of the sea. You know the waves will keep coming, but you cannot say which one will be largest or when it will arrive. The Earth will keep moving, faults will continue to strain, and sooner or later the crust will lurch again. The question is not if, but how often, and how well humanity will be prepared to live with what comes. Over the next centuries, earthquakes will remain one of the most constant and dramatic reminders that the planet is alive beneath our feet. The forces driving them are not slowing down. Mantle convection will continue for as long as the Earth retains its heat, and tectonic plates will grind relentlessly against one another for millions of years to come. From the San Andreas Fault to the subduction zones of the Pacific, the machinery is still wound tight. What changes is not the quakes themselves, but our understanding of them, our technology, and our ability to adapt. The possibility of megaquakes, those rare giants of magnitude 9 or greater, looms in the background of seismic science. They are uncommon, but history tells us they will return. Subduction zones, particularly around the Pacific Ring of Fire, are the breeding grounds for such titans. The 2011 Tohoku quake in Japan and the 2004 Sumatra Andaman quake in the Indian Ocean were stark reminders that the planet is capable of generating events that release as much energy as thousands of nuclear bombs. In the next few centuries, there is little doubt that other regions, such as the Cascadia subduction zone off North America's Pacific coast, will produce their own megaquakes. The question is when, not if. For societies near these zones, the challenge is balancing awareness with resilience. Living with the knowledge of a looming catastrophe can be paralysing if fear takes the upper hand, but it can also be empowering if it drives preparation. Japan, for instance, has accepted that it will face major quakes in the future. The nation pours resources into engineering, early warning and public drills. It is a culture where earthquakes are not forgotten but anticipated, woven into everyday life. If the coming centuries see more megaquakes, the key to survival will be not just technical ingenuity, but cultural readiness. It is also possible that humanity's growing influence on the surface of the planet will shape the seismic future in subtle ways. The melting of ice sheets, the redistribution of water due to rising seas, and even the filling of vast reservoirs may influence the timing of some earthquakes. These changes will not create entirely new fault lines, but they may nudge existing ones, advancing the clock of rupture in some regions. Future seismologists may look back on the 21st century as an era when human activity began to leave its fingerprints not only on climate, but also on the timing of the Earth's deep processes. Yet while the prospect of quakes to come is daunting, there is also a quiet kind of reassurance in their inevitability. Earthquakes are not accidents or anomalies, they are part of the planet's design. They build mountains, open oceans, and recycle crust. Without them, the Earth would be static and life itself might never have flourished on such a dynamic stage. To fear earthquakes is natural, but to recognise their role is to see them not just as disasters, but as the ongoing heartbeat of the planet. Technology will play a growing role in reshaping the human relationship with earthquakes. Early warning systems are likely to become faster and more accurate, perhaps even incorporating artificial intelligence to sift through seismic noise in real time. Buildings will continue to evolve, with materials that flex, absorb, and even repair themselves after shaking. Entire cities may one day be designed with seismicity as a central principle, rather than as an afterthought. For coastal communities, tsunami defences will grow more sophisticated, combining natural barriers like mangroves with engineered seawalls and rapid evacuation routes. The hope is that while earthquakes cannot be stopped, their toll can be greatly reduced. At the same time, cultural attitudes will continue to shape how societies respond. In some places, earthquakes are already viewed with a kind of awe, reminders of humanity's smallness against the planet's vast forces. In others, they are met with humour as residents swap stories of wobbly chandeliers and jelly-like skyscrapers. Fear and awe sit side by side in this relationship, balanced by the human instinct to adapt. The future will likely be no different. Each quake will leave behind both grief and resilience, each recovery a testament to the stubborn will to carry on. There is a chance, too, that our descendants will look back with surprise at how little we once understood. Just as we marvel today at the myths of giant catfish or wrathful gods, future generations may shake their heads at our crude models and clumsy attempts at prediction. Perhaps they will discover signals in the crust we cannot yet detect, faint whispers that precede ruptures. Or perhaps earthquakes will remain forever unpredictable, their timing a mystery beyond human grasp. In either case, the relationship between people and quakes will continue to evolve, shaped by both science and story. It is worth remembering that earthquakes are not evenly spread across the globe. The centuries ahead will likely see some regions remain largely untouched, while others experience repeated upheavals. For those in quieter zones, earthquakes will remain distant news stories, tragedies seen on screens. For those along restless plate boundaries, they will remain a lived reality, shaping culture, politics, and identity. This unevenness will continue to shape the way humanity as a whole perceives seismicity as both a global phenomenon and a deeply local experience. In the grand sweep of geological time, the quakes of the next few centuries are mere flickers. The Himalayas will keep rising, the Andes will keep stretching skyward, and the Pacific will keep shrinking. Earthquakes will remain the punctuation marks in these ongoing sentences of creation. For us, though, each quake is a story of loss, of survival, of adaptation. The human cost is real, but so too is the human capacity to learn, rebuild, and find meaning in the shaking. The quiet future of quakes, then, is not one of silence. It is a future where the Earth continues its restless shifting, and where humanity continues to grow wiser in response. Megaquakes will come again, just as they have before. But so too will innovations, communities, and cultures shaped by the need to live with uncertainty. The balance between fear and awe will persist, tempered always by the drive to adapt. To imagine the centuries ahead is to accept that earthquakes are not a problem to be solved but a reality to be embraced. They are reminders of a living Earth, one that still shapes itself beneath our feet. And while the ground may never promise us peace, it does offer us perspective, that resilience lies not in stopping the tremors, but in learning how to stand firm, and sometimes even to sway, when the world beneath us moves. We have wandered through a restless story, one told not in words but in tremors, in sudden jolts, and in the deep patience of stone. Earthquakes are at once terrifying and awe-inspiring, reminders that the ground beneath us is not as still as it seems. They are destroyers when cities crumble, when homes collapse, when lives are changed in seconds. But they are also creators, sculpting mountains, shaping valleys, and writing the outlines of continents. The shaking of the Earth is not simply disaster. It is part of the artistry of a planet that is never finished. From the hidden motions of mantle convection to the visible scars of faults, earthquakes remind us that we live on a dynamic world. They connect the surface to the deep, the human story to the geological one. Without them, there would be no Himalayas or Andes, no rift valleys splitting continents, no cycles of renewal that refresh the face of the Earth. Every tremor carries the memory of millions of years, and every mountain ridge or ocean trench is a monument to countless quakes that came before. And yet, while the planet moves in epochs and eons, human beings live in decades and lifetimes. For us, an earthquake is not an abstract process of geology, but a visceral experience. The rattle of windows, the shudder of the floor, the fragile realization that even the ground cannot always be trusted. It is in that gap between the slow patience of the Earth and the quick urgency of human life that resilience takes root. Across history, societies have adapted in remarkable ways. Temples once crumbled, and so new methods of construction were born. Wooden houses bent with the shaking where stone walls would fall. Skyscrapers were engineered to sway like reeds rather than snap like brittle branches. People told stories of gods and catfish, of serpents and angry deities, not only to explain the mystery but to carry memory forward, so that each generation would know that the Earth sometimes moves. Out of fear came rituals, out of disaster came science, and out of ruin came rebuilding. This is the duality of earthquakes. They remind us of our fragility, but they also reveal our capacity for resilience. Where the ground has shaken, people have returned. Cities rise again on the same faults that tore them down. Communities scarred by loss find strength in solidarity. Each quake leaves behind grief, but also knowledge, a lesson in how to build stronger, how to prepare better, how to endure with dignity. The Earth's patience is measured in millions of years, but humanity's strength is measured in how quickly it adapts. There is too a quiet beauty in recognizing our place in this restless cycle. The quakes of deep time gave us the landscapes we cherish today. They raised the mountains we climb, carved the valleys we farm, and even influenced the paths of rivers that carried ancient peoples to new lands. Without earthquakes, the Earth would be static, and in that stillness, perhaps lifeless. To live on a trembling world is to live on a world that grows, renews, and transforms. Of course, earthquakes will strike again. Somewhere, someday, a fault will slip, and the ground will move with startling force. But that inevitability is not only cause for fear, it is also a reminder of connection. Every tremor ties us to the deeper workings of the planet, to the same forces that shaped continents and guided the course of life. In those moments, we glimpse the vastness of Earth's story and our own role within it, small, fleeting, but part of the whole. And so, we return to patience. The planet works slowly, with calm persistence. We, on the surface, adapt quickly, with creativity and determination. It is in this meeting, between deep time and human time, that resilience blossoms. We cannot stop the Earth from moving, but we can learn to move with it. We can prepare, endure, and rebuild, just as countless generations have before us. As this journey comes to a close, perhaps the most comforting truth is this: earthquakes, for all their power, are not endless. The shaking fades, the dust settles, life continues, communities gather, children return to schools, markets reopen, and the world carries on. The Earth, having sighed and shifted, resumes its silence. And in that silence, we remember that fear does not last forever, but resilience does. The Earth will shake again someday, but tonight it rests, and so can you. Let the story of a restless planet become not only a reminder of fragility, but a lullaby of endurance, patience, and quiet wonder. For even in its trembling, the Earth holds us, and even in our vulnerability we find strength enough to live, to rebuild, and to dream on ground that is never entirely still.